Welcome to the world of Diablo.
It burns!
I'm your host, Scott Diablo Marcano.
Well, I'm not a crook.
I'm a filmmaker and comic book publisher, and I want to talk about something that's cool, or interesting, or entertaining, or gets us thinking.
Whoop-de-doo! What does it all mean, Basil?
So take a deep breath, take my hand, and let's take a journey together through the twisted world of Diablo. Hey everybody, Diablo here, and I'd like just to share a few thoughts about the current geopolitical situation. This is from a little blog essay I wrote called The Grand Inquisitor. Ironically, or maybe expectedly, it was the Russian novelist Dostoevsky who in his masterpiece, The Brothers Karamazov, made perhaps the greatest analogy of the dilemma of the modern political state and the tragedy of the human condition. This analogy comes in the singularly brilliant passage commonly known to the world as the Grand Inquisitor chapter of the Brothers Karamazov. Now, if you're not familiar with this great work, or this particular section of it, I'll briefly summarize it for you. Without getting too deep in the weeds of the sprawling details of the epic novel, in the Grand Inquisitor section, Dostoevsky describes a disturbing encounter between the infamous Grand Inquisitor of the Spanish Inquisition and the Savior, Jesus Christ. In his account, the Grand Inquisitor is taking a break from condemning and torturing religious heretics and takes a trip through his medieval city in Spain. While being carried aloft by his minions, the Grand Inquisitor sees a crowd gathered around a man preaching in the streets. The Grand Inquisitor takes a good look at the street preacher and immediately recognizes him. It's Jesus Christ. The Grand Inquisitor knows he's looking at the Savior, the very Messiah in whose name his religion is based upon, in whose name he has been torturing and killing people. Yet, in spite of this, he orders his henchmen to immediately arrest the Savior and hustle him out of sight. Once he has the Messiah chained up in the bowels of his favorite dungeon, the Grand Inquisitor sends all the guards and torturers out so he can speak to Jesus Christ alone. The two have a very sobering conversation, although it's the Grand Inquisitor who does most of the talking. He informs the Savior that he indeed knows he's God's son, but he really doesn't care. He tells the Savior he plans to keep him locked up in his dungeon until he dies in obscurity and is forgotten. The Grand Inquisitor admits that in spite of his outward appearance of being a disciple of Christ, the horrifying reality is that he's not at all interested in doing anything remotely associated with spreading love or continuing God's work. No, my friends, the Grand Inquisitor's true ambition is not peace on earth, but rather to maintain power and control over society. Humanity is nothing more than chattel, he argues, chattel that must be subdued through violence, greed, and fear. Religion and the church is just a means to accomplish this goal. Now, as awful as this omission is, when the Savior tries to argue that the Grand Inquisitor is morally bankrupt and leading humanity astray, the Inquisitor just laughs at him. He tells Jesus that he really doesn't understand human nature the way he does. People, he says, don't want salvation. In truth, all people really want is bread. And as long as the Grand Inquisitor and those in power give them their daily bread, they'll be satisfied and forget all about the Savior. Dostoevsky wrote this seminal passage in the 1800s, while all of Russia was living under the absolute rule of the Tsar. But it still rings true today as we see the horrors of Vladimir Putin and the invasion of the Ukraine unfold before our eyes. Pretty much every authoritarian dictator, from Hitler to Papa Doc, has used this brutal logic to maintain control and power over their subjugated people. The logic is always the same. So long as people are fed and have a semblance of security, order, and predictability in their lives, they'll tolerate whatever sins their strongmen or government force upon them. The sad, underlying truth of this cynical assessment is hard to escape. While some may argue that the average Russian citizen is completely brainwashed by Putin's propaganda machine, I, for one, am skeptical. In my humble opinion, I think the Russian people know damn well that Putin is a brutal, corrupt son of a bitch, that the war in the Ukraine is a lie, that their soldiers are probably committing war crimes. The problem isn't that they're naive or misinformed. The problem is they really don't care about any of these sins because Putin's giving them their bread. That's why no one should be holding their breath waiting for a popular uprising against Putin. It's not going to happen, folks, period. At least not until most of his bloody machinations have played out for a long, long time. Unfortunately for the Ukrainians and the world at large, the greatness of the Russian people has always been hamstrung by their inherent cynicism and appetite for authoritarian government. The need for a strong man is nothing new in Russia. Many who study Russian history have consistently pointed out that it's an instinct that runs very deep in the Russian culture and collective consciousness. Indeed, the Russian people's entire history is one of being brutally suppressed and exploited by powerful rulers. This tragic chain of events goes back centuries to the insanely violent conquest by the Mongols. After Russia was savagely conquered by Genghis Khan, the Mongols pitted the Russian aristocracy against itself and used it to enslave the Russian peasantry. Only the most ruthless Russian nobles survived this blood-soaked era of foreign domination. And this really set the tone for everything that's followed in Russia. For to serve the Mongol rulers meant to serve a Russian prince or noble who was willing to backstab his brother in a real-life game of Survivor. Additionally, it also meant that one had to be willing to slaughter whole villages on command in order to wring every last drop of blood and gold out of the peasantry. After the terrible yoke of the Mongols was finally passed on and the Golden Horde, which is what the Mongols called Russia, ceased to exist, the Tsars took their place. But instead of freeing their own people, the Russian nobility who survived the Mongols had been so thoroughly perverted and traumatized that they become a ruthless pack of wild rabid dogs. They had no ambition to reform the horrors of the past or build a great nation, but rather they reverted to the one thing they knew best: how to enrich themselves at the expense of the common folk. Hence the Tsars, right from the start, adopted the same repressive policies towards the lowly serfs that their former masters, the Mongols, had. This is the period when the Tsars, with charming nicknames like Ivan the Terrible, arrived on the world scene to make life even more miserable for the average Russian. That's when vodka became an exclusive state-run enterprise to keep the serfs drunk and weak, which is a whole other topic worth exploring in another essay, by the way. When the revolution finally came along and toppled the Russian monarchy, it really changed nothing. If anything, the plight of the average Russian citizen became only worse. Murdering Tsar Nicholas and his family in a basement didn't improve the lives of anybody in Russia. The Tsar was merely replaced with the Red Tsar in the form of Joseph Stalin, who built an industrial-grade killing machine that murdered tens of millions of innocent people. What's happened to the Russian people is truly one of the greatest tragedies of human history. They have suffered, with a few exceptions, like no other. Not just from their own horrible rulers, but from the impact of almost constant invasion. First it was the Vikings, then it was the Mongols, then the Teutonic Knights of Germany, then the Swedes, then Napoleon, then the Germans again, then the Germans again. And I don't mean to make light of it. What the Nazis did to the Russians is without equal in the history of warfare. It was total warfare on such a mass scale that our minds can barely grasp the level of horror and carnage associated with it. With this in mind, one can understand why the Russians are a bit defensive about their border situation. It doesn't excuse Putin's actions in the Ukraine, but it does explain the appeal of his message to the average Russian. The Russian people must have collective PTSD by now from all the brutality they've suffered and all the invasions since the 7th century. They are arguably in the top 3 of the most attacked and traumatized people in the history of the world. But sadly, having suffered all this, there's no light at the end of the tunnel for most Russians, as Putin's rule isn't much worse or better than anything that came before it. It's just the same bloody Tsar, different day. So why complain, comrade? This mentality is somewhat understandable, as Putin took over a Russia that was incredibly weak and corrupt. This was the Russia under President Boris Yeltsin. The former Soviet-era republics were breaking away from Mother Russia. The economy was in free fall. The country's infrastructure was collapsing. Their sports teams were getting trounced in the Olympics and everywhere else. Now, Putin changed all that. The thing is, Russia is just as corrupt as before. but no one would dare say the country is weak. Now, while our efforts to contain Russia on a geopolitical level are vital and important, we should also recognize the limits of what we can do. The U.S. and its NATO allies have the military capacity to stop Russia from going beyond the Ukraine, and economic sanctions will eventually have a great impact on the Russian bottom line. However, we must also recognize that we have little sway over the hearts and minds of the average Russian citizen. As immoral and aggressive as Putin is, he has given Russia its bread. We must understand that. We really do. Because until recently, Putin's one-dimensional fossil fuel-based economy was producing decent growth and well-being for its long-suffering citizens. Small business and entrepreneurship, the bedrock of our economy, just really isn't a thing in Russia, where most people rely on the government and huge oligarchy-run companies for employment. By the Russian way of thinking, the Grand Inquisitor, i.e. Putin, put a stop to the security threats and international humiliation of Russia. Who cares if he slaughtered countless Chechens, Georgians, and Ukrainians to do it? I mean, Comrade Putin even put nation in Olympic gold medal stand again. I mean, never mind the fact that he instituted the greatest doping scandal in post-Cold War history to do it. The point is, Russians are winning. Russia is strong, intimidating, and safe again. And to a Russian population which has suffered so much, baby, that is all that matters. Just to make sure no one objected to any of this, by the way, Putin, the Grand Inquisitor, shut down the free press, murdered and beat and jailed anyone who spoke out against him. His only real opponent in Russia is Alexander Navalny, and he's currently rotting in a prison, just like the savior from the brothers Karamazov. And the Grand Inquisitor, Putin, just laughs and says, "Who cares?" Because in the echo chamber of Russia run by Putin, the truth doesn't really matter anymore. MRGA is his slogan, and that stands for Make Russia Great Again. And it rings true for the majority of the people eating Putin's bread. Sadly, the Grand Inquisitor will remain in power for the immediate future. Eventually, the economic sanctions us and the Europeans have imposed, and the isolation that Russia has from the rest of the world might start to erode Putin's power. But so far, there's no indication that any efforts of the West will lead to a palace coup that topples Putin. Equally disturbing is the fact that there are many wannabe Grand Inquisitors out there passing around bread. Indeed, democracy and rule of law are under constant assault everywhere right now. Not just in Russia, not just in the Ukraine. Hungary's Viktor Orban, Poland's Duda, El Salvador's Bukele, China's Xi, France's Le Pen, and yes, our own wannabe dictator, Donald J. Trump, are all hard at work convincing their deluded followers to take the bread and stop thinking so much about truth and decency. And tragically, in many cases, it's working. Indeed, one might view the 40-plus year attempt by conservatives to overturn Roe v. Wade through the same lens. In exchange for the bread of stopping legal abortion, conservatives made a devil's bargain with the Grand Inquisitor stand-in, the Turtle Pope, Mitch McConnell. And they convinced him to ignore the proper Senate rules and deny Obama his rightful judicial appointment. Then they turned a blind eye and deaf ears to the pleas of Brett Kavanaugh's sexual assault victim, and they let him sail through confirmation. Finally, they put a cherry on the top of this dumpster fire by going back on their own words about no nominations close to the election in order to ram Amy Coney Barrett's nomination through it a week before the election. The whole spectacle was as shameless and dishonest as anything ever seen in the U.S. government history, which, by the way, is saying a hell of a lot. However, it was all justifiable to most conservatives so long as they got their bread out of it. That's why we need to be just as vigilant here at home as abroad. In truth, Donald Trump poses a far greater threat to us than Putin. Putin won't invade the U.S. and topple our government. Donald Trump can. He came damn close to pulling it off on January 6th, and he will certainly try again if given the opportunity. That's why I say, if you're a conservative, fine. I respect you. Stick to your beliefs. But if you support Donald Trump and his election lies and can't wait to see Trump in the White House again, then you're a card-carrying member of the Grand Inquisitor Club. Yes, inflation sucks. Yes, Biden has made mistakes. But you know what sucks worse than high gas prices? An authoritarian dictator in the White House, or worse yet, a bloody civil war that tears this country apart. So please, my friends, I urge you, do everything you can to stop Trump and wannabe Trumps from getting into power. Go hungry before you give in. Fight for what's right. It starts with standing up for democracy and rule of law. But whatever you do, and however you do it, don't delude yourself into believing the Grand Inquisitor's lies. Don't take the bread.